Question for Stephanie. Totally fascinating paper. Thank you very much for it. I wanted to just ask you about a couple of details. So you said that we basically don't have any information about the habitations at Tadmor throughout the Islamic period. So do we know for a fact that it was continuously inhabited? Do you have like evidence for that? And also, how much do you know about the details of the actual kind of on the ground procedures that the French used to move residents out of the city?
So those are great questions. Am I speaking into them? You can hear me? Okay. So for the first question, there are extant historical photographs that show us the site very densely occupied around the Temple of Bel. But there have also been excavations conducted, actually Khaled al-Assad and others have conducted excavations outside of the Temenos area that show that the area outside of Temenos might have been occupied first, actually. So there may be some, but the problem is that we don't actually know the answer to that question because no excavations were carried out of the Islamic period residences on the Temenos at all. They were simply destroyed and removed. So from what the available evidence that we have, what we know from archaeological excavation, it appears that the area kind of surrounding the Temple Temenos was more intensively, or I would say kind of continuously occupied through the Byzantine and early Islamic period. And that habitation later seems to have been clustered. At least, we could gather that by the end of the 11th century, there was a substantial enough, group of houses inside the Temenos that it was fortified. But yet we just really, that's the tragedy of that earlier act of destruction.
I don't think that affects your argument in any way.
It is possible, yeah, it's possible. I mean, here's what we know. We know there was Umayyad occupation outside of the Temenos because we've excavated those areas. And we know that there was fortification by the end of the 11th century. It's possible that in between there's some kind of, break, but yeah. That's the loss that we're facing when you carry out that type of an action.
And then for the French, have you looked at all into archival materials?
So I haven't actually. That's something I would like to do, to actually go into the French archives and see what we can uncover. I have been in touch with a number of the French archaeologists. We do have some photographs. Kind of, I showed you a couple from this sort of episode of clearing of the site, and so. We know that it happened extremely rapidly, and we know that people were contemporaneously sent over to this other area. And there are still living people who preserve the memory still, of living in that area. They're very old now, of course, some of them, but some of them also spoke to their children about it. So it might be possible to kind of do some kind of anthropological reconstruction of that, and that would, I think, be really an important thing to do, actually, before it's too late. I think I put up the quote from Salam al-Kuntar. Did I put that on this slide? Yeah, where she spoke about her mother remembering living on that site, and about that same kind of affective relationship that appears in many of your sources, and which I think is a very human thing. You could look at it two ways. I mean, there are certainly, there's always this question of, it's easy to dismiss this as, well, it's just the most practical place to live because it's high and it's sort of, easy to fortify and so on. But I think people also, it's very clear from many of the sources we have that people wanted to live in and near and by these places because they had other kinds of meanings just beyond the purely practical. So I think that's where we need to now turn our attention.
I just want to add anecdotally that when I was in Paris 3 years ago, there was a huge exhibition devoted to Palmyra and its destruction.
Yes.
And when I saw it, I said to myself, why is this exhibition happening? And your paper just explained it.
Well, and also why is the destruction framed as only this barbaric thing that happened 4 years ago and not this
what's the
continuous ongoing process, right?
I say something. The man who organized all that was Henri Seyrig.
Yes.
And you can remember that Seyrig during the war was one of the first to be engaged for the Gaullists, and he was the French attaché culturel here in Washington, in New York.
Yeah.
And he organized a discussion with a lot of people, Lévi-Strauss was he, and a man, Nicolas Callas. a Greek poet, a surrealist poet. And Callas wrote an extraordinary piece of poetry in modern Greek, which was never translated in English or French, which means the way in which the archaeologists destroyed the temple of Delphi.
Oh, wow.
So, as you know, Selig was the father of Delphine Selig. He was a man involved in all these exchange on surrealist sculpture. So, it's very interesting to see Selig as an archaeologist in the 20s in Syria, acting as a kind of modernist, and Selig after the war, looking at the past with a much different approach.
Oh, I would love, that's fascinating, thank you. I mean, it should be said that Palmyra, of course, is not, I mean, the Acropolis in Athens is also a created heritage site. You know, I mean, there was a mosque on the Acropolis as well.
7,000 people were expelled by the Americans from the Acropolis. 7,000 people.
So Palmyra is not a lone story, so to speak, but you know, in the case of asking questions about Islamic uses of the past or Islamic antiquarianism, it's a really telling one, I think.
Adam?
To Stephanie, thank you for your presentation. I was going to say Acropolis, Mussolinian Rome, but also Constantinople in 1847. After the restoration of the Hagia Sophia, that's what the Ottomans did. They cleared the monument of those wooden buildings that kind of
Function change again.
yeah, so it's a universal modernist kind of thing. And I'm pretty sure that if the Ottomans had held on to Palmyra a little longer, they would have done it before the French.
Maybe, I mean...
Oh, well, definitely, and that would have brought in one major dimension. I mean, are the Ottomans Muslims, or are they, I mean, in this context of talking about antiquarianism in Islamic societies, we assume that the Ottomans are Islamic, but I mean, the Ottoman Empire is not exactly an Islamic empire, which means that their reactions may be antiquarian but not Islamic, or vice versa, and whatever. I also have a problem with the comparison you draw between ISIS, destruction by ISIS, and non-destruction / preservation by early modern or medieval Islam. I think that given the material ease of destruction today and the difficulty of destruction in medieval times, the comparison doesn't really work in that sense. I mean, early modern, and I'll take again my guys, the Ottomans, I mean, they don't destroy because destruction is not a viable option, first of all. When they have to destroy, they know how to destroy. I mean, they have destroyed the Church of the 12 Apostles to replace it with a mosque. So it's not really preservation for the sake of preservation. It's preservation because destruction is sometimes much more expensive and cumbersome than that. So to ascribe some kind of a virtue to non-destruction is a bit problematic. Also, when you talk about the Serpentine column, you said yourself that there was always another story, and there's the story of the three heads were decapitated of the Serpentine column by the Ottomans, who kind of used it as a bullseye for whatever sport.
Much later, however.
In 1700.
Yeah.
In 1700,
Yeah,
which is,
it was
early modern
some-
enough. And it took them 150 years and a Greek archaeologist to find them during the excavation. So what I mean to say is that there's always such a palimpsest of stories. It never really ends up being a black or white kind of story between the good guys and the bad guys, or it doesn't work that way given that's otherwise, yeah, I understand. I think it's a well taken point. But I mean, historically speaking, I think we need to clear those gray areas.
Thank you. That's a great point, and I completely agree. I mean, I don't think you can, it's not like early Muslims.
And I'm Turkish, so I can do Ottoman bashing. It's the Jerry Seinfeld syndrome.
I mean, we don't need to overstate or be apologetic or anything of that nature. But but what I'm trying to kind of bring attention to is the fact that we have a problem when we want to study Islamic antiquarianism, because often the sites that we would go to were razed or destroyed in modern times. So when you look at a site like Palmyra and you want to ask yourself, how did Muslims care for this site for 1,300 years? When you ask a question like, what was the Mosque of Palmyra that sat on that locality, for over a millennium? All we have is that map, or that plan, right? And so this is an enormous loss, and it just sets out one of the challenges, the hurdles we have to cross when we try to look into this. But thank you. That point is very well taken.
Abby and then Antoine.
This is a very brief comment, which is just that this is such an interesting thing to think about the Temple of Bel and Palmyra as a site, as something created by the French out of a much more complex history, because I think it also helps explain the violence of ISIS. You look at the postage stamps created by the French Mandate, they have Palmyra on them. They have the Temple of Bel on them. They have many of the sites and objects, both in Syria and Iraq, that ISIS then went and destroyed. And they also appear on the money. The Temple of Bel appears on Syrian money, first made by the French Mandate and continued all the way through the secular nation state right up to 2011. And now actually I think it's the American Mandate money in Iraq, the American occupation money in Iraq also continues to show the same ancient sites that are seen as the heritage of humanity. So these objects and these spaces become symbols of the modern nation state and of European and American colonial encounter. And so it makes them targets of a group that seeks to abolish the borders of the modern nation state and recreate some imagined borderless caliphate. But it's really telling that what they're actually destroying is something that was not just valorized by the French, but also created by them or recreated by them.
Yes, and in fact, if you watch ISIS's videos, that's exactly what they say. They say these sites are the idols of Western civilization. They basically point to, ancient sites, essentially, because ancient sites are the sites that were created as being the heritage of Western European civilization. That's what they actually say directly. So they say we destroy these because they're idols. We don't want Muslims to worship them, but we also destroy them because these are the idols of the Westerners. Mm-hmm. So heritage is an idol in ISIS's formulation. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, shirk.
I have a small, minor maybe question for Stephanie. Do we have a sense? You've explained the limitations both in your talk and in your 2017 article, but do we have a sense of the relationship between the mosque discovered by Joukowsky and the mosque in the Temple of Bel? I think if memory serves, Denis Joukowsky says that the mosque by the intersection of was over the imperial temple. So do we have a sense of the chronology? For instance, do we have an earlier layer and then later on some kind of recovery or a new discourse with regard to the Temple of Bel, or is anything to be said on that front?
Again, in my article, I kind of hedge my bets a little bit and say 800 to 1300 years for the mosque and the Temple of Bel, precisely because that's kind of the terminus for that earlier mosque. So it may be that, people were, if I had to, this is pure speculation, but if I had to hazard a guess, I would say that people were probably living in the old sort of area of the city of Palmyra up until the Crusader era, and then they probably move inside and the site is fortified. That would be my guess, but again, we just will never know, right? Because we don't have the evidence.
Sure. My point was rather whether we could imagine that. You could imagine both mosques functioning at the same time. That's one option. Yeah. But you could also imagine that at some point they relocated the mosque because they developed a new antiquarian discourse with regard to the Temple of Bel that was not there earlier. So maybe that's a way to understand how, for instance, I'm oversimplifying, if the Umayyads and the Abbasids had a different take on this.
That's very interesting, because what that makes me think about is an argument that I made when I was thinking about the fourth of my categories, which is what I did in my book, essentially, which is the notion of inscribing history on the land through these sacred histories that happen through these sites. In the case of my book, I was arguing about the revival or the rediscovery of pilgrimage sites. that happens very intensively between the 11th and the 13th centuries in Syria. And I argue, although we don't have sort of the text that would tell us this, but I argue that it must be somehow that we now know that there were over 400 churches built in the Crusader Kingdom of Jerusalem in that short 80-something year time span, right? This is an astonishing rate of construction, and it couldn't be that the people next door didn't notice this kind of, intensive sacralization of the land via all of these monuments and sites. So in other words, it could be that something like that also was happening at Palmyra, whereby, the old thing suddenly was kind of injected with new meaning during this period of Crusader sanctification of ancient sites, or of sites associated with the Bible.
I think we have time for just a couple of questions. Keep them brief because the almighty coffee hour is waiting for us. First question.
This is for the eminent professor from Paris. It's just a minor comment on poetry that on some of the slides that you showed. And one was talked about a garden they settled on springtime carpets striped with flowers and bordered with streams and water channels. And this is very interesting because as somebody who's interested in the history of carpets, there are some famous garden carpets showing streams and fountains, and they don't date much earlier than like the 15th century or 16th century. But here, this is a poet from the 11th century talking about a carpet that I don't know about the translation of the exact translation. Maybe there's a flaw in the translation. I'm not 100% sure, but I don't know how much veracity we can give to some of
This is connected with the Persian concept of the paradisos.
This was Al-Mu'tamid visiting Al-Zara.
Medina al-Zara is a famous city in front of Cordoba, which was completely destroyed after the fall of the ruler. And the Medina al-Zara remained for years and years the most visited ruins in Al-Andalus. If a king or a prince is coming to the ruin, you have to figure the landscape. So the garden in the Al-Andalus tradition is part of the landscape. So you look at the ruins, but you recreate the ruins in a kind of fantastic garden, which is part of this dialectic. But you find it in the West with the first printed book on Antiquarianism, illustrated book, is Macchia Pamphili, which depicts a kind of reverie, of dream, of a man looking at the paradisos, and in the paradisos you find all kinds of monuments and waters, and this vision of the garden as a center of relaxation, as a kind of peace connected with the influence of the ruler, which is some part a gardener.
One of the most astonishing objects that's described at Ctesiphon, right, is the carpet that was said to hang behind the throne, right? It was called the springtime of Khosrow, this carpet, and it was said to be this vast sort of textile that hung behind the throne that depicted this garden, was ornamented with jewels, and yeah.
There was one other.
Sorry, let's go on to the last question.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your presentation, Stephanie. I have a question about how to classify attitudes towards the past. I appreciate your pointing out the kind of parallels between ISIS violence to a place and the kind of archaeological way of doing things. But I wonder whether you can also slice this in a different way, because from the way you describe the integration of the Palmyran ruins into the town of Tadmur, it seems to me that it's not really an issue of these ruins being remains of the past, but rather being part of the present, reuses of the present. But in a sense, I think the ISIS approach to it is, in that sense, not very much different, because it's also, there's a kind of eternal presence of disbelief that can tempt people. The same attitude towards the Brahmin Buddhas, for example. I mean, the reason why we can all be upset about the destruction of these things is because we don't actually take them seriously as religious, like expressions of religious truth or something. Like we have this certain aesthetic category of heritage, world cultural heritage, which is totally aside from whether we are believing Buddhists or believing Roman pagans or polytheists. So in a sense, there is a parallelism there as well, right?
Yeah, and I think that brings us back to the issue of heritage being a kind of an idol in their formulation. And that's, it's Mullah Omar